Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Easy Conversations, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dandia. In this week's episode, I sit down with Scott Mayer from Parents Mental Health Support. Scott has 7 sons, and the birth of his 7th son was quite traumatic, to the point where Scott thought he was going to lose his wife. In this episode, Scott shares some of the work he's done to deal with that trauma and trauma from earlier in his life of being a veteran. Scott also shares the work he's been doing in the parents' mental health support space and how he communicates with his sons. I hope you can get a lot out of this episode, and if you, at the end you could leave a 5-star review, I would truly appreciate it. All right, Scott, thanks for joining the podcast today. And, I appreciate you taking the time and super grateful for you to come on here and share some of the work you're doing and specifically talking around parents' mental health. It's a huge issue right now, as you can imagine, with the pandemic and some of the lockdowns. So, I would super excited to hear your story and some of the stuff you guys are doing.
Okay, yeah, thank you. My name's Scott Mayer, father of 7 boys. My eldest is 18 and my youngest is 2. And pretty much what I talk about and what I do is based on my experiences having them. What happened, we had one, what you class as straightforward delivery. Mm-hmm. The other were complicated. And 3 of them were particularly traumatic, but it was the last one 2 years ago. We had a planned cesarean section, and sort of after the surgery, once my son was born, they realized he had a problem with his lungs. He wasn't breathing very well by himself, and he was 4 weeks premature. So we knew they were going to have to monitor him, but it was slightly more severe than anybody anticipated. Mm-hmm. So he was rushed off to the neonatal unit. And I remember just in that moment trying to think, should I stay with mum? Should I go with baby? Where do I go? What do I do? And I went to check on my wife, and she seemed okay. No, she wasn't feeling fantastic. So we waited till she was what I thought a little bit more stable. Then I went to go and find out what was happening with my son. And I talk about this quite a lot. And I think it probably seems like I'm using it for drama factor, but it's not. I went down to the neonatal unit, and when I got there, the staff that met me, I explained to them what had happened, and I was looking to find out what happened to my son. And they said that they needed permission from mum before they could tell me what was happening. And I sort of remember standing there, almost shaking my head, thinking, this is my son. What other permission do you need? And so about sort of 5-10 minutes went past, and they came back and they started to fill me in on what had happened. And they took me in, and my son was there in the incubator, and I'd had 6 other children, and I wasn't really ready for a neonatal unit. I didn't think it would have the effect it did. It was a very scary place to be, and mm-hmm. It felt very unnatural, the fact that I couldn't pick my son up. I couldn't touch him, and I didn't really understand what was going on. So once they'd filled me in and explained that he had this difficulty with breathing, they had him on the machines and they were going to monitor him. I then decided I'd go up and sort of fill my wife in on what had happened. And my wife and I, sort of, to take it back a little bit, we were 16 when we met. We met on our college induction day, and we've been together sort of 22 years ever since. So this woman this was her 7th baby. She gave me 7 babies. We'd known each other since we were kids. And I remember thinking, I've got to go and tell her what's wrong, and I'm trying to think, do I tell her the full truth? Do I try and sugarcoat it? Mm-hmm. If I hide it, she's going to know I'm lying. She knows me that well, and that's just going to make the situation worse. So I was trying to think, right, what do I tell her? And then when I got there, I realized that she wasn't feeling very well. Mm-hmm. And I spoke to the staff, and they said, that they'd noticed that she wasn't very well. And over the next 3 days, I kept sort of raising the alarms that I was very concerned that she wasn't well. And they just didn't listen to me. There's lots of different reasons. There's lots of different theories as to why that is. A father in a maternity unit, the voices are not really listened to, or whatever the reason was, or maybe it was the way I was coming across. There's lots of different theories, but what happened is they didn't listen to me. And in the end, my wife got very unwell and she almost died. And it got to the stage where I actually said goodbye to her. And I sort of told her to look after the boys. I apologized that I hadn't been able to keep her alive. And in that sort of moment, I broke. Emotionally, I just snapped. I've never really been able to articulate it any better than just the fact that I snapped. And I didn't really know what I was experiencing at first. My wife recovered, my son came home, and things went to that sort of happy place where everything should be okay, and things were aiming to somewhat normality. But I knew I wasn't. I knew I wasn't the same. I knew I was struggling. I didn't know what it was. I just thought it was depression, whatever it might be. So going to the doctors and talking to the professionals, there really wasn't that much awareness that I now know. What I was experiencing was trauma related, and it was birth, and you can call it postnatal depression, you can call it postpartum in dads, whatever we call it. It was related to that. And I then went through therapy and did sort of about 10 sessions of therapy. And it wasn't until sort of I went through that process that it was more sort of PTSD. It was more trauma related than depression from what I'd witnessed, and the fact that my wife was going to die. And when you look at the world and society as it is, and how we look at men and mental health and emotions and feelings, society would have you believe that what happened to me doesn't happen, and that men don't feel these things, and this doesn't happen to fathers when they witness it. And there wasn't any real awareness or any information for me to sort of figure out what was going on. So because it was just deemed as depression and you get antidepressants, I wasn't really feeling better because I wasn't dealing with the root of the problem. Just kept thinking we'd give antidepressants and everything would be okay, and it wasn't. And then about a year ago, Mark Williams, who you mentioned that you spoke to before, I heard him doing a speech. And he was talking about his story and his experiences. And it was that light bulb moment where I thought, oh my God, that's what happened to me.
Yeah.
That's the story. All these things this man's describing. So then I was able to go to my sort of healthcare professionals and say, look, this is what I think I'm experiencing. And then you start to be able to deal with it once you know what it is. And when you sort of point it out and say that when it comes to childbirth, becoming a new parent, everybody experiences a change in their mental health. That those hormones, those emotions, it does cause an imbalance, and it's not always severe, but I believe it happens to every new parent. And especially if you add traumatic deliveries or traumatic or anxiety antenatally, you add all of this stuff, it has to sort of come out somewhere. And what happens is that, particularly with fathers, from the limited research I've done, the lots of research that I've read, is that it manifests and comes out much further down the road. So by the time it comes out further down the road, it's just, again, it's anxiety, it's depression, it's under that big umbrella, and they don't link it back to a traumatic delivery or, God forbid, baby loss, or even just depression in the perinatal period. They don't ever link it back. So this problem's never properly dealt with. So when I spoke to Mark Williams and I understood a little bit more about what I went through, I decided that I wanted to try and create platforms where we could address this, we could talk about it, and we could sort of give fathers a voice a little bit. And I worked for a few charities in the UK. I started talking to other dads, and like in mass, lots of different dads, different focus groups, Zoom chats, all this stuff. I realized very, very quickly that what happened to me and my experiences of sort of being ignored and not engaged with when baby was born, not involved in the antenatal process, nobody really wanting to know my opinion on baby's development, and everything that I had experienced, plus the traumatic deliveries, and the fact that when these things go wrong in maternity units, the professionals don't really fill dads and partners in. They don't really explain. So you just witness all of this happen and you've got no control. And it's a very powerless place to be, and that can have a massive impact. So we have to sort of start to to change this. I've got 7 boys. I'm not naive enough to believe that I'm going to have 7 dads, but I have some parents. And I thought that what the services that they have to be better than what we experienced.
Right.
So we've got to and do things. And like I said, the more I spoke to more dads, I found that my case wasn't unique. And it's very nice to get that, oh, I'm not alone. It wasn't just me. I mean, there is a lot of comfort in that, as bad as that sounds. Probably comfort's the wrong word, but it does help to know that you're not alone. But it also made me very sad to think, why are we here? Why in this day and age can we not understand that fathers and partners and men in general have these feelings, have these emotions? I mean, the role of a man and the role of a father over the last 20 years have evolved massively. There's a very shift in terms of stay-at-home dads, more involved dads, single dads, 2 dads, 2 moms. I mean, the family dynamics have changed.
Absolutely, yeah.
That we've got. Society hasn't kept up. So what it does is it sort of punishes, particularly men as a stereotype. It punishes us for what they think we should be. And I think until we start to change how men and how fathers are viewed, it'll be difficult to move it forward. And the only way we can really do it, and it's things, I think we're further ahead in here than we are, definitely in America, in terms of how we see paternal mental health and the fact that it is starting to be talked about more in fathers. But it's when you sit there and you look at it and you look at all the signs and symptoms for postnatal depression in moms. If you looked at that list, there's nothing on there that fathers can't experience. The bonding and attachment issues, that can cause problems on its own. The balance. So everything that we look at, one day, and I reckon in the UK, probably 10 years down the line, they're going to turn around and they're going to say, why didn't we do something about this? Why didn't we take this serious? And when you look that in the UK, the number 1 killer for men under 50 is suicide. So more men in the UK under 50 take their own life than they die to any form of cancer or disease or work-related accidents. So we know there's a big problem. And we can link it back to lots of different things in life, from adverse experiences to childhood. But there is going to be a percentage of that are dads, that have experienced these things. And like we talked about a minute ago, or like I said, sorry, it manifests further down the road, and we don't have to see how bad it is. But when suicide is number 1 killing, you've got a problem.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think along those lines, how you said where it manifests like down the road, I think that's with any form of PTSD. If you're not actively dealing with it or talking about it, it shows up in different ways. And whether it's through a traumatic experience of the birth of your child or something else you've experienced that's been traumatic in your life, it does show up in different ways later down the road. And I think having these conversations is equally important, as you've highlighted. And I think, you mentioned that society has been punishing men because of the role we had, several generations ago. And as we've evolved, society hasn't caught up. But I think at the same time, it is our responsibility as men to be having these conversations and pushing back on the rules and having these having the awareness of some of the struggles we also as men face, whether it's through becoming fathers or just existing in society in general, around some of the stigmas we have around how men should perceive situations, how they should feel things, how they should express themselves. All of that, I think, needs to change because of the way our roles have evolved in society.
No, you're right. Absolutely, 100% agree with everything you've just said.
Yeah.
And I do, we have a responsibility. I mean, what I hear a lot, and I have this conversation with quite a few people that I'm close to, that I talk about things, that we always hear that men won't talk and they won't talk about emotions and they won't have these discussions. We're proving it right now. If you give them the platform, and if they're allowed the space to talk, men do talk, and they do share. But I do think that we are partly to blame. We do. I mean, I talk about my experiences quite openly now.
Yeah.
It wasn't for a long time. And that's why I try and talk about the promotion of talking and sort of peer to peer and this sort of stuff, because I didn't do it for such a long time. I know that hindsight's wonderful, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But what I know now, I think I wish I'd spoke sooner.
Mm-hmm.
When things got at their worst 2 years ago, and it wasn't, like I said, till I went through therapy, I realized these problems have been there for years.
Mm-hmm.
It just, in this moment 2 years ago, that was sort of the straw that brought the camel's back. That was the final straw. It was things that had happened in my previous life. I'm ex-army, so I'm a former military. So there's lots of different things that have had these triggers, and that was just the one that. So when I started to understand the domino effect of mental health, I was able to piece back. I had antenatal anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
After a previous trauma, terrified it was going to happen again. That got to the stage I couldn't enjoy that pregnancy because I was worried the whole time. But you don't really sort of see that at the time. I actually spoke to my GP about it once, and they said, "Oh, it's just because of the pregnancy," and they could see that I was anxious, but didn't see it as anxiety. So just sort of really didn't do very much about it at all. And when I sort of sit there and look back, I think, we have to have these conversations, but the professionals have to be able to receive it. And I think that's where there's a lot of education to get done. And I think more men would have these conversations if they felt not sort of judged or that there was places to talk. They're not really there. And I think particularly in America, I've been really surprised. I've done a few podcasts and spoken to a few people that I thought that the quality of sort of perinatal mental health care in the UK was bad, but I mean, there really isn't anything.
Yeah, no, and it's very similar in Canada as well. Like talking to folks like yourself in the UK, I've been talking to quite a few people in the UK, and it appears that, there's a lot of focus even from the government side, and, the politicians are talking about mental health awareness quite a bit over there. But here we don't have that same level of awareness or conversations. I mean, people talk about mental health, but then when it comes to like doing something or putting actions in place or spending the money, that's not happening, unfortunately. And especially right now with the pandemic, and when the world returns to a state of normalcy, we're going to see more issues because right now we're kind of like in lockdown, but people are going to be anxious when they have to return to normal life, being out again, going to work, seeing people. So unfortunately, right now, I'm not seeing any proactive measures or actions that can, mitigate some of those issues that may come up. And those are things we should have foresight on. So it's unfortunate. And I guess in your case, you mentioned like past trauma potentially that was probably building up and until the birth of your last son. But I think for you also, like, you've got 6 other boys that you were being a father to, right? And that brings its own challenges. And we don't appreciate that because you also have to be tending to these other children while you're dealing with the birth of a new one. And we don't talk about that. There's no support around that either for parents.
That's a really good point, actually. And yeah, I think you probably put it better than I could. I never really put it that way in terms of you don't want to say the added stress, but you wear a lot of different hats.
Yes.
And this is that, I speak to quite a few dads is just trying to get that balance, and I keep saying it, you're not going to get that balance all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You are going to get it wrong. And we talk about sort of perfect parents, they don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
They're just not out there. We all struggle. It's a very difficult job, probably the hardest job you're ever going to have.
Mm-hmm.
And it does come with a lot of added pressures. And this is one of the other things that I talk about when if my children go through a bad experience or they're not well or they have an illness or whatever might happen. The fact that dads and partners and can find that difficult. You know, especially my youngest, with him having problems with his lungs and being on neonatal unit. When COVID first really became a thing, and we were talking about the effects on people's lungs, you know, I'm absolutely terrified.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm trying to think, oh, what's going to happen? You know, what's going to happen if this happens to him? What if he gets this? What's it going to do to him? But then that's not just because of COVID-19. I mean, if he gets a bad chest or a bad cold or something, you know, every time I overanalyze it, and I can feel myself sort of spinning out, and it gets quite overwhelming until he starts to feel better, and then you sort of release a little bit. And obviously it's the same with my other children, but because of what he went through, it sort of heightens it. But there's nowhere to really talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not the sort of thing that, I mean, like I said, I'm an army lad. It's not really the sort of thing that you talk to your friends about as such, you know, your emotions and your feelings. And you've still got a lot of people that you'll meet this resistance of, well, what are you complaining about? You didn't give birth. You didn't have the baby. You know,
Mm-hmm.
how can you against this? You know, and there is a lot of that out there. I think it's definitely worse. Obviously, Canada and America, without a doubt. We still get resistance here in the UK, but I think we're probably a few years ahead.
Mm-hmm.
We started investing money in it here, and it's like we've got a new long-term plan with the NHS. Sorry. And in that long-term plan now, under perinatal mental health, it says that if the mother goes through what we have, a perinatal mental health team of professionals that will help with postnatal depression and psychosis. So if mom goes through that team, then dad will be screened for his mental health in the UK. So that's in part of their new long-term plan for the NHS. So it's not brilliant, but it's definitely a start, because one of the statistics that I talk about quite a lot is that if one partner has postnatal depression, it's up to 50 times more likely that the other partner will experience it, supporting them. So by bringing this screening in, it's to sort of help the dad that's supporting the mum, so we can start to see if his mental health is being affected. Mm-hmm. So it's a very start, but like I said, we've been putting money into perinatal mental health for quite a while now. So I mean, we're definitely a good few years ahead of anything that's going to happen, if anything happens at all. Yeah. Stateside or in Canada, but it is progress. Ideally, we will want all parents, and I think this should be everywhere across the world. All parents should be screened for mental health antenatally, and I think that screening should start from what we call in the UK sort of booking appointment. So your first appointment at hospital. So when you go there and you get your hospital notes and stuff, from that point, mental health should start to be, and it shouldn't be, let's talk about mental health. You know, they should be educated to drip feed it, you know, to pay attention. Because like you said about the other stresses, now that I'm sort of in this world and I've met different people, I started to take sort of mindfulness seriously, you know. And in the past, you know, that was sort of hippie stuff, and I'd laugh at that. You know, meditation and yoga and breathing techniques, you know, I cringe at my former self, but that was how I used to think. And now that I look at it, and I like journaling, you know, when my mental health was at its worst, I started to just journal, just write some things down, write down how I felt. And then as I started to feel a little bit stronger, I would like write letters to my future self, sort of 2 weeks at a time. Yeah. And we're not talking big, long letters, you know, it may just be a couple of paragraphs. But what it started to do is that I would see that I was in a better place than I was when I wrote it. And obviously, sometimes you're not, sometimes you're in a worse place. But when I sort of looked at it every couple of months, and I looked at these letters and I thought, right, I'm better than I was. You know, things are moving forward. And I sort of, I kept doing that. So I kept more journaling, and then I started breathing techniques. I looked into sort of meditation. Everyone says how good yoga is. Never really got to yoga, but I did introduce things, and I thought this helps, you know. And like I said, with you pointed out, you know, the 7 boys, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of pressures. There's times where it just gets overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And we sort of talk about self-care. People think it's this big indulgence, you know, but just sort of a couple of minutes of breathing techniques, or a few minutes in a dark room, or what I find helps quite a lot is I have different songs depending on what I need, and I'll just go and listen to that song for a few minutes, and it's going to calm me down or it's going to pick me up. Doesn't always work, but you just try these little things, and it just sort of helps hit reset. Whereas in the past, I was very guilty of being absolutely okay, and then just boom, like, can't cope with this anymore. That's enough. Stop. I need to go out for a walk or go for a drive, and it would. Now that by introducing these small little snippets, things, you just stop it. Obviously, not all the time. There's still days, and this is something that I always try and say to people, that my darkest days were very dark. I don't normally go deep into detail. I understood suicide, and that was enough for me. I didn't make a plan. I never went that far, but I understood how you could get there. And I thought, well, this is when I thought, God, I really need help. This is my rock bottom. I need to do something. I need to move it forward. And when it's that bad, when you break bad, you never really get over it. It's always there, in my opinion. You just learn to manage it, and the dark clouds or the storms, whatever you call them, they just become less often. But I think it's always something that's there, and not everybody will agree with that. That's just my opinion. And when you break, I suppose, I got to put myself back together, and what I did is I put myself together how I wanted to be, because I spent most of my life being what I thought everybody else thought I should. I tried to parent the way that I thought a man that was a soldier should parent, and that wasn't me. So I was almost I wore different masks, is probably the best way to put it. So what the world seen wasn't the same as what was in my house, and that was bloody exhausting. Just trying to keep up with that all the time. So I sort of made a bit of a vow that I won't do that anymore. I'll try and be what I want to be, and sometimes you have to cut toxic things out of your life, or even toxic relationships that don't do you any good. You've got to make that decision. And I think once you've been really hurt, you'd see things a bit differently. And I think it's easier to see perspective. And I get angry at myself, thinking, why didn't I see it? But I don't think it works like that.
No. And I think we need to have that, I guess, grace for ourselves, knowing that, at that time we just didn't have that information, or we just weren't ready to have that awareness. And awareness comes with time. And sometimes you need to hit rock bottom to really, take ownership and accountability to do better.
That's true.
And yeah, I mean, like you said, hindsight's 2020. It's easy to look back and be like, oh, what was I thinking, and question your choices. But in the moment, you were doing the best you could, or you were doing whatever you needed to do at that time. And now that you know better, you do better. And that's kind of how I look at life. But I do agree that we tend to put that pressure on ourselves of living someone else's idea of a life, and that with that comes, like I said, additional stresses, and often you catch yourself living up to someone else's expectations, and that's not good either. So when you talk about some of the dark clouds, and I know you mentioned that they're always there, and I kind of agree with that. I think, if you're struggling, those dark moments or thoughts are always there. And sometimes when you get triggered, they're more prominent. And that's when you get certain thoughts, right? And whether you can call it suicidal thoughts or just depressive thoughts, until you don't actually face them and do something about it, they will always be there, like you said. Do you mind sharing some of that, if that's okay?
Yeah, I'll share. Yeah, I'll share any of it. I'm quite open. In terms of how it felt.
Yeah.
Or yeah. The only way I was ever really was in the beginning, when I first started, call it a spiral. When I went on a bit of a spiral down, and I knew I was changing. And the only way that I've been able to describe it, it was a bit like being outside a window. and you're trying to shout to the person, but they can't hear you, you know, and it was a bit like trying to shout to myself. And I used to do it all the time. I could feel myself getting very angry or very sad, like really quickly. And I could tell it was changing, but I couldn't stop it. And some people say that they couldn't see it. You know, I could. I just couldn't do anything about it. And what I sort of realized is as it got worse, and I got to this stage where you just don't feel anything.
Mm-hmm.
You're not sad. You're just nothing. It's almost numbness. And all the things that would normally fill me full of joy, you know, my wife, my children, whatever it might be, it was just nothing there. And when I sort of try and talk to other parents, and one thing that sometimes people get a little bit upset about is that I say if we support both parents' mental health from the antenatal period and in the beginning, and we support them properly, it's got a better outcome for the child. And that's not a criticism of anybody's parenting. That's just when you're in that moment, you're just surviving.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have all of yourself to give. And I say that because I know, you know, that I was here, I was with my children, but I wasn't really there, you know, because some days I was literally just trying to hang on. And it was these sort of negativity, you know, and I've had lots of different theories, and so I've spoke to counselors about where it comes from, but it's just this inner critic that tells you you're not enough, you know, that tells you, and you can trace it back to childhood, whatever it might be, but there's always this voice. And like you said, when you're struggling, when you're in your darkest, that voice is very loud.
Mm-hmm.
What I found myself is I left the military because I was injured, and I struggled to make that leap from soldier to civilian. I just, you know, I've got a few things that I think why, but it's just to do with the programming of the mind, and you go from one to the other very quickly, and I just couldn't. So sort of depression and mood had been there for a while, and it just became easier to link it to that than it was to link it to anything else that had happened during childbirth. So for such a long time, I'd had these, I don't know, episodes, you know, changing mood, depressive, a little bit angry, sad, emotional, distant. And it had gone on, and it sort of came in spikes, and it came in. And when I look at it now, they all came in and around the pregnancies and the births after the traumatic deliveries. So it just kept increasing it. So I kept thinking, why do I feel this numb or angry or anxious or sad when this is supposed to be the best time of my life? This is supposed to be the best that happens, and I can't get with the program. And then that voice gets louder, and it tells you you're definitely no good. You're a terrible dad because you can't even get excited about the pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm obviously not realizing it was because I was worried the trauma was going to happen again. And you're almost sort of trying to protect your mind a little bit, thinking I can't go through this again, you know, because last time it was bad, and each time it gets worse. But what I found out is once I started to recover, I don't like the word recover because, like I said, I don't think you ever fully do, but the recovery journey or the recovery path, once I got onto it and I thought, like you said, I kept waiting. I had to take self-ownership of where I was. And yes, I had injuries, and I was treated for chronic pain, which I still am.
Mm-hmm.
And I allowed these negative things to control who I was. And what I often say to people is that the brain will believe what you tell it. You know, and for a very long time, I told myself I was no good because I wasn't the man that I was. I wasn't this soldier. So because I wasn't this soldier, I was automatically nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And years I bought into it. I believed it. And I kept waiting for somebody to fix me. You know, this magic wand of I can make you feel better. And like I said, I tried different counseling. I tried therapy. I had multiple surgeries to try and fix me physically. And I just kept, and then it was literally 18 months ago. I sort of sat there and thought, the only person that gets me out of this is me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's quite an enlightening day, that day where you realize, all right, I've got to do all the work, but at least it's in my hands.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I can't tell you what part of the process I was at, but I just know that I'd had a few days where I didn't feel as bad as I had. And I thought, okay, you know, so I started to introduce just things to keep me busy, whether it was like building something or writing something or just things to keep the mind busy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd try and do something positive or something with my children, or when I started to introduce the mindfulness, just things to break this cycle so that I didn't see it, everything as negative. I started to be able to see the positive in some things, you know, because for such a long time, I just seen the negativity in everything. And people that are close to me in relationships, you know, for years they told me, you know, very negative, very negative. And that wasn't always me. You know, I become very negative, and I'd programmed myself to be negative. And then when you start to reverse it, and I see that what made me bad is the same that can make me better. You know, I've just got to tell it different information.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, some days I still get it wrong. You know, I still have bad days, and I've I've never really been able to describe it any better. So you can edit this out if you want, if it's maybe triggering. But the only way that I've been able to describe this sort of dark cloud is it's like a stalker. It's always there, waiting until you let your guard down, until the moment of self-doubt, until that trauma, until that bad day where you think, oh God, and then pounces, turns your world upside down, disappears again. And it's hard to keep that guard up all the time, you know. So this is what I mean, where I still think that the bad days for me will come. I think the difference is most of the time you can maybe see them coming.
Yeah.
You start to feel the strain, you know. I know I do. I mean, at the moment I'm doing a lot of things on social media, and I am quite busy, and what I've realized is that I can start to see that it's getting a bit much. It's getting a bit overwhelming, because what I talk about most of the time is some of the worst days of my life. And it's, you know, you repeat that. So you sort of relive it. So you're almost self-inflicting some of your pain because you're not burying it. But when I first started talking about my story and my experiences, especially with like my wife nearly dying, it was through my maternity hospital. They asked me to sort of feedback as a father, because not many do. And they wanted just to see a different side. So I had to write this sort of story about 6 times. Because the first time I wrote it, I got really angry. The second time I wrote it, I got really sad. And then I got really bitter. And then I started to get a mixture of all of it. And if they listened to me, this wouldn't have happened. You know, it wouldn't have had to get that bad. And like, my wife wasn't well for quite a while after that. And I got really angry. And then I managed to do it. And I thought, you know, that feels all right. And then I did it again. And I thought, by talking about it, it did help ease it. It became easier to share, and the more that I do it now. But then, like I said, there is still some days where I think, like, that's enough, you know. Or somebody might ask me a question about something to do with mental health, and I just can't process anything else to do. That's it. I'm done. The shop's shut.
Yeah.
And it's realizing that, whereas I think sometimes you don't. So if you listen to your, and it makes me sound like a hippie again, but if you listen to your inner self, you know, more often than not, it knows what you should do, and it will sort of warn you when things get too much. But that inner self, like we've just talked about, can be very negative sometimes, you know. So double-edged sword, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on many important things, and I guess I want to kind of summarize them in a way. But you know, I think the most important thing is being able to talk about it, like you've been doing, and like you've highlighted. And by doing that, you're getting rid of the stigma that you yourself create. And by not talking about it, you're hiding from the truth. So by talking about it, you're normalizing it. You're saying, you know what? Yeah, this happened and it wasn't great, but it is my responsibility to deal with it. And like you said, when you have that cloud over you, like the negativity cloud follows you around all the time. And the goal is really to be mindful of it. and change your thought patterns, like you said, and that's stuff I've had to do too, is changing that negativity thought pattern when one little incident happens and how it triggers like a massive, overwhelming, like you get these thoughts that where it's like, oh, you're not good enough. See, here's another example. And it's becoming mindful of that and changing your thought pattern. And the goal for me is to reduce the frequency of that negativity or the negative thoughts coming in. So instead of once a week, try to target once a month, and ultimately get it to the point where you yourself are able to manage it even when it happens. And I think that's some of the stuff you've talked about. And I guess even your experience of coming from the army, of being a soldier, I think for you, it was losing your identity. You were attached to this identity of being the stereotypical man, and losing that identity, and losing it not by choice. It happened to you and you had no choice or no say in that matter. And I think that's probably where that anger was coming from, because you didn't really get to have your voice or your opinion on it.
No, do you know what? Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it took me a long time to see that was this. I lost what I thought I was.
Mm-hmm.
And didn't really realize that was just part of who I was. I was still the same person. I just maybe did a different thing now, and it's easy to say that now.
Yeah.
For a lot, I did. I when I went through, I think it was the first time I went through counselling, and they said it was a bit like a breakup or a divorce for more often than not, there's one person that wants that divorce and one that doesn't. One that doesn't. That was me. I was getting divorced from this situation, and I didn't want it, so I paid for it, and I wanted it, and it was because it wasn't my choice. And when you see it that way, it's very obvious. But at the time you don't necessarily see it, but that's exactly because it wasn't my choice. You're right.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, I think the goal is to become aware of it, and you're right, like it's hard when you're so caught up in it, and we all kind of have our own journey, and even myself, there's been times where I've struggled and I just couldn't figure it out, and I have high expectations of myself, but I just couldn't figure it out. And then you look back and you're like, this was so obvious. Why did it take me so long? But that's part of the healing journey, is you need to experience it so you can come out. And then once you come out of it, having that compassion for yourself, because you needed to experience it to a certain extent to be able to appreciate everything else after the fact. So I think that's a lot of the stuff you've talked about around even mindfulness. And I think it's amazing because when we talk about, as men, we want to change the way men are perceived in society, and part of it is our responsibility, and another responsibility for us is to teach our children differently, right? So for I've got one son, you've got 7, but by role modeling these behaviors we're talking about, whether it's mindfulness or just having that awareness or just feeling confident or comfortable enough to talk about our struggles, we're role modeling that behavior for our children. So then when they get into the real world, they have the tools that weren't given to us. And that's how I think we can change some of the stuff society's dictated and push back.
No, that I agree with you. To be fair, I don't claim to be father of the year, and I don't claim to be fantastic, but I do believe I'm the best I can be, and that's enough. It's been a long time, but for years I did look for perfection, and I thought perfection looked like strength. So not showing the fact that these weaknesses and these struggles are there, and not letting my children see my flaws. By that, I was setting the right example, and yet again, sometimes you have to go there to come back.
Yeah.
And because I went through, I see things very differently now. And because of what I went through, I don't want my children to ever go through that. So we have those conversations early, and I think, like you've just said, and this is something that I firmly believe, that I'm teaching them the best lessons that I can by showing them life's not easy, life's not hard, and it is a little bit Rocky Balboa, but nothing will hit as hard as life. It won't.
Mm-hmm.
And it is literally not the getting knocked down. It's the characters in how you get up,
Mm-hmm.
and let them see that, that, yeah, I make mistakes and I have to put this mindfulness in place so that I can be the best I can for you, so that I'm always there to be able to be open up, but also have the conversations with our children that, I have 2 rules for my children in terms of what they do when they grow up, and happiness and kind. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they want to be a doctor or a painter or whatever it may be, as long as they can come back to my eyes and say, Dad, I'm happy, and they're a nice person, everything else is fine. So we have these conversations. So a lot of the expectations are not, I wouldn't say they're not there, because obviously you still want your children to achieve and they want to achieve. But one of the conversations, I'm a big fan of education. So what I might say here might sound like I'm not, but we have a focus, and I think it's around the world, but I can only really talk about the UK. We have a focus on creating good students, and sometimes we miss creating good humans.
Mm-hmm.
The human part is far more important. And I always tell my children, you never finish learning. Education never stops, because life is education, and you can always re-educate yourself at any point in that life. So you can resit exams, you can resit entry exams, and they're not the end of the world. You can't resit your childhood.
No.
So by giving them the tools to even help them now, my children have been through things at school, and as most kids, they've had upset, they've been picked on or whatever it might be, and giving them the tools to acknowledge the fact that it's okay to feel upset, it's okay to feel sad, because when we don't talk about it, what we teach them is that you should be ashamed of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that you shouldn't talk about it. So we're punishing them by not having that conversation, and then punishing them by the fact that they think they have to hold on to this. And again, that's not a big criticism of anybody in particular, and I don't claim that my parenting skills are better than anybody else's, but I've seen the relationship that I have with my children, and it's better than it was, by doing it this way, by letting them see the vulnerability, by having these conversations. And sometimes when they act up, or if they get upset, or if they get angry, or they misbehave maybe, and yet again, I don't claim to get it all right, but rather than punishing that outburst and saying, go to your room, or you're not playing your Xbox, or give me your iPad, because that's sort of telling them that these emotions and feelings are wrong. And no emotions and feelings are wrong. They might be ill-placed, but they're not wrong to have. So I try and educate it a little bit, or try and introduce a little bit of, right, you go and stand in the garden in the rain for 2 minutes and let yourself sort of calm down and ground yourself. You go into the bedroom and put your music on, and then we'll talk to you when you've calmed down. And I try and introduce the same, so that when my children do something, I don't turn around and say, right, you're grounded till you're 65, because when you're always over punish. And then you've got to go and have that conversation and say, right, you're not obviously not grounded for 65 years. And so I try but I get it wrong, and sometimes I'll snap, I punish them, and I'll ground them, and then I think, oh, I shouldn't have done that. And then you feel that parent guilt, because you've snapped at your child because you were trying to do something else, or you're trying to do 100 things. And it's perfectly natural. But if we don't sort of communicate and address it, it becomes more of a problem. If our children can snap at us and then apologize, and there's no real punishment, and we can snap at them and then say that I'm really sorry, I'm busy, I'm on a deadline, or I'm trying to do this, that relationship, in my experience, is better, by having these conversations that we are flawed, we do make mistakes, we all have to work on it, and mental health is just as important as physical health.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I think that's important thing you've touched on, and I've mentioned it in other podcasts too, is just having that vulnerability as parents, and not creating this hierarchy, treating them as individuals as we want to be treated, and showing them that it's okay to make mistakes. And either side, whether you're a child or you're a parent, you're going to make mistakes, and having that freedom of making a mistake, seeking forgiveness, and promising that you'll do better next time. And that's something I model with my son as well. And I think by, like you said, by punishing them for their emotions or their outbursts, the message we're sending them that is that it's not okay. And then that's the message they grow up with. And then they hide certain emotions because they know if it comes out a certain way, they're going to get punished, or people are just going to think it's not healthy. So I think that's very important that you've touched on. And I think this has been great, Scott. Thanks for sharing your story. I really appreciate it. By having these conversations, this is how we can improve some of the stigma that we've created, and making it normal to have these conversations. I think it's important that we share our stories. So again, I want to commend you for that. And I guess for listeners that, I know you've touched on it a little bit, but that want to get a hold of you or find you on social media, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, on Instagram, I'm PMH Support. And on Twitter, I'm Scott Mayer 9. That's probably the two fastest ways.
Okay. And I guess again, around the whole aspect of, and PMH is parents' mental health, for folks that, are struggling, whether they have newborns or just struggling in general, it's not easy being a parent, right? Like you said, it's one of the hardest things you probably have to do in your life. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with it. What are some things you can share, or final message that you would have for whether moms or dads that, are sometimes feeling like it's too much or overwhelmed?
Yeah, I'll give a few little tips. One I always say is, parenting is the hardest job, but it's the only job in the world where you're put in charge on the first day with no experience.
Yeah.
You've got to figure it all out. So sometimes we're very critical of ourselves for not being able to do it like other people. And you will become your best parent at the right amount of time. It doesn't always happen overnight, and it's something that I talk to dads about quite a lot, that just because someone hands you a baby, you don't instantly have that connection and that bond. It can take time. So that's perfectly normal. Make sure you make time to talk to each other, talk about the emotions, the feelings. You don't agree on everything in life. Parenting shouldn't be any different, and the fact that we have to challenge each other on how we see things is perfectly normal. Mm-hmm. We don't feel it when we're tired. My number one tip is sort of laundry, housework. Forget it. If you've got a newborn, focus on baby. Take any help that you can. Anything that wants to help with the cooking, and sort of spend as much time with the baby. Mm-hmm. For the dads, what I talk about a lot is sort of skin to skin, because the oxytocin is obviously good for you, it's good for baby, but it helps with the mental health and helps with the bonding and the connection. Not everybody talks about it a lot. Maybe it's not everybody's cup of tea, but for me, I enjoyed that sort of skin to skin with my sons, and trying to be as hands-on around the baby to develop that bond and the smells and get baby used to me. So that's another tip that I give. But the main one is keeping that channel of communication open, I think, talking to each other. But if you are concerned, just understand that everybody experiences parenting differently. But anybody that tells you that they found it easy is probably lying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like you said, I think it's important to highlight that everyone's experience is different, and you cannot compare. Like some people, their baby never stops crying. Some people, their baby doesn't eat. Everyone's experience is different, and it's just focusing on your child at that time and doing the best you can, like you said. And it does take time.
It does. You're right. It does. Definitely takes time.
Yeah.
Well, so thank you very much. No, thank you. It's been a blast. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. No, I appreciated it. Well, that's the end of the episode. Thank you again for tuning in and showing your support. Until next week.